The night stretches on, empty and endless. A street lamp buzzes, flickering in the rain. Somewhere, in the vast silence, a car door slams shut. A breathless voice whispers on a phone call, just 5 words before the line goes dead. No one will hear from them again. A man walks into a store, picks up a single item, pays in cash. Hours later, he's found dead, the cause of death, unknown. A woman vanishes from a parking lot in the middle of the day. Security cameras catch a blurry figure in the background. A shape. A shadow. A presence. But when police rewind the footage, the figure is gone. 5 crimes. 5 people who never saw it coming. No pattern. No warning. Just the unshakable feeling that something was waiting for them in the dark. Some say evil is obvious, that you can sense it before it strikes. But what if it isn't? What if it moves silently, unnoticed, until it's too late? A locked door isn't always enough. A familiar face isn't always safe. And a simple, ordinary decision, the road you take, the drink you buy, the person you trust, can lead you to a place you were never meant to be. Tonight, we follow the trails of 5 disturbing crimes. Some remain unsolved, their mysteries stretching across decades. Some are so twisted, so unexplainable, that even the truth feels like a lie. And some remind us that the worst horrors aren't found in ghost stories or nightmares. They are real. They are out there. And they happen when you least expect it. This is where it begins. Story 1. A man steps off a plane. He moves with purpose, blending into the crowd, just another traveler passing through. There's nothing remarkable about him, no nervous glances, no hesitation. He doesn't rush. He doesn't linger. He carries a small bag, nothing that draws attention. Just a seat on a flight, a ticket bought in cash, a destination known only to him. Somewhere, miles away, buried beneath layers of dirt and leaves, a box waits. Inside, a gun. Rope. A pair of latex gloves. Cash, stolen from a past crime, untouched. He buried it here years ago, in a place he knew he'd return to. A place where no one would ever suspect what was coming. He has no connection to the city he's in. No family here. No friends. No reason to be walking these streets, except for the one only he knows. He doesn't hunt out of anger. He doesn't kill on impulse. He is precise. He is patient. And by the time anyone realizes what has happened, he will already be gone. A missing woman. A ransom note. A security camera capturing a blurred figure in the dead of night. The clues won't make sense at first. A crime with no clear suspect, no obvious motive. Police will search for patterns, but there won't be any. Because this wasn't random. This wasn't reckless. This was planned long before it ever began. For years, he did this. Moving from state to state, choosing his victims carefully. He didn't leave evidence behind. He didn't make mistakes. He took what he needed, and then he vanished. He was the kind of killer law enforcement dreads, the kind that doesn't fit the profile. No messy crime scenes. No predictable behavior. Just a ghost, slipping in and out of places unnoticed, erasing every trace of his presence. His name was Israel Keyes. And by the time the world knew who he was, it was already too late. This is his story. Israel Keyes wasn't nervous. He wasn't angry. He wasn't like the others who had sat in that chair before him, pleading, lying, unraveling under the weight of their own guilt. No, Keyes was different. He smiled. He joked. He played along, like this was all just another game. And in a way, to him, it was. The agents asked the questions, but Keyes controlled the conversation. He gave just enough to keep them listening, to keep them wondering what else he knew. And then, without a hint of remorse, he said something that made even the most seasoned investigators go still. "I'll tell you about the others." The others. Not one. Not two. But multiple. Victims spread across the country, killed in different ways, at different times, in different places. No connection between them. No pattern. No way to link the crimes together, because Keyes had made sure of that. And now, sitting in that cold, windowless room, he was the only one who knew the full truth. He never hunted close to home. That would be reckless. Instead, he traveled. He would fly to one city, rent a car, and drive thousands of miles to another, paying in cash, avoiding cameras, making sure there was nothing that could ever tie him to a single place. Then, when he found the right location, he would wait. Sometimes, for days. Sometimes, for weeks. No one was ever chosen at random. Keyes didn't strike in the heat of the moment. He didn't act on impulse. He planned, meticulously, down to the smallest detail. And long before he ever picked a victim, he had already buried what he needed. He called them kill kits. Metal boxes and plastic tubs, buried in the ground, waiting for the day he would return. They were scattered across the country, hidden near hiking trails, abandoned properties, empty fields and places no one ever thought to look. He left them there for years, untouched, knowing that one day, when the time was right, he would come back. And then, he would kill. It was February 1st, 2012. A cold night in Anchorage. 17-year-old Samantha Koenig was finishing her shift at the Common Grounds coffee stand, just minutes away from closing. The security camera footage would later show her taking a final order. A customer standing just outside the window. Their exchange looked normal. Routine. But then, something changed. Samantha suddenly stepped back, lifting her hands. She turned off the shop's lights. And then, she vanished from view. Her father reported her missing the next morning. Friends and family searched the area, hoping she had simply run off, that she would come home. But then, the text messages started. Her boyfriend received a message from her phone, "I'm spending a couple of days with friends. Tell my dad I need time." It didn't sound right. It didn't sound like Samantha. And when her father tried to call, there was no answer. Days passed. Then weeks. No leads. No sign of her. And then, a breakthrough. A ransom note, demanding $30,000, along with a photograph of Samantha, her hair neatly braided, a newspaper placed beside her as proof that she was still alive. But she wasn't alive. What the family didn't know, what no one knew, was that Samantha had been murdered the very night she was taken. Keyes had kept her body frozen, carefully staging the photograph days later to make it appear as if she was still breathing. It was a cruel, calculated act. And for Keyes, it wasn't just about the money. It was about control. About making the world believe he was still holding her, long after she was already gone. But he made a mistake. On February 29, 2012, Samantha's debit card was used at an ATM in Texas. The surveillance cameras caught a shadowy figure withdrawing money. And then, in Arizona, another withdrawal. And then, in New Mexico. A pattern was forming. Law enforcement tracked the card, city by city, until finally, on March 13, a white Ford Focus was pulled over in a quiet parking lot in Lufkin, Texas. Inside the car, they found the ATM receipts. Samantha's phone. Her debit card. And the man who had taken them. Israel Keyes was finally caught. But this was just the beginning. Because as investigators soon realized, Samantha Koenig was not his first victim. She was just the last one we know about. Some men fight to the very end, to escape, to survive, to leave behind some version of the truth, no matter how twisted it may be. Israel Keyes was not one of those men. He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He didn't try to explain himself. Instead, he did what he had always done, he made sure he was the one in control. On the night of December 1st, 2012, he sat in his cell, alone. The walls around him were bare, the air thick with the weight of things unsaid. No one knew what he was planning. No one realized that by the time the sun rose again, he would be gone. When the guards found him in the early hours of December 2nd, the first thing they noticed was the blood. It had soaked through his sheets, pooling onto the cold concrete floor. A razor blade, smuggled in and hidden among his belongings, lay nearby. His wrists were deep with gashes, his body limp, his breath long gone. But there was something else. A series of drawings, crude and hastily scribbled, scattered across the small desk in his cell. 11 skulls, etched onto scraps of paper. Some had been drawn in ink. Others, in his own blood. 11 victims. Maybe. Or maybe it was nothing more than another one of his games. Because without a confession, without any more clues, the truth had been buried with him. Keyes left this world the same way he had lived in it, without answers, without closure, without a single piece of evidence that could bring peace to the families of those he had taken. How many more victims were out there? How many missing persons cases, how many unsolved murders, could be traced back to him? We may never know. And that is the most disturbing part of all. He didn't just take lives. He took the truth with him. He made sure the questions would never have answers. But not every killer chooses to disappear. Some remain ghosts, not because they are unknown, but because they were never caught. A name without a face. A shadow without an identity. A trail of bodies left behind, but no trace of the one who left them there. The next killer never bragged about his crimes. He never confessed. He never sat in an interrogation room, playing mind games with detectives. Because he was never found. And to this day, he may still be out there. They call him the I-70 killer. And his story begins, on a quiet afternoon inside a small, unassuming store. Story 2. It started with a single shot. One pull of the trigger, one body on the floor. No forced entry. No robbery. Nothing taken. Just a store clerk, alone, lying motionless behind the counter. At first, it seemed like an isolated incident. A tragedy, but not a mystery. A small-town murder, the kind that shakes a community but doesn't send waves beyond it. But then, just days later, it happened again. Another clerk, in another town. The same execution-style shooting. No witnesses. No signs of struggle. No reason. Just death, swift and absolute. The year was 1992. Small businesses lined the highways, their neon signs glowing dimly in the early evening. These were the kinds of places where people felt safe, where clerks worked alone for hours, passing the time between customers. The kind of places no one ever expected to become crime scenes. But as spring turned to summer, the killings continued. Store to store. Town to town. The victims were different, but the method never changed. A single gunman. A single weapon. A single shot to the back of the head. And then, he was gone. Police had no description, no surveillance footage, no fingerprints. No one ever saw him come in. No one ever saw him leave. The customers who walked through those doors just minutes later never heard a struggle, never saw anything out of place, until they looked behind the counter and saw the blood pooling on the floor. A ghost, moving along the I-70 corridor, leaving nothing behind but bodies and questions. Investigators pored over crime scenes, searching for something, anything, that could tie the murders together. But there were no personal connections between the victims. No shared enemies. No clear motive. And worst of all, no suspect. A man who could kill without hesitation. A man who could disappear without a trace. A man whose face, to this day, remains unknown. 6 confirmed murders. 6 families left without answers. The killings stopped as suddenly as they began. No more bodies. No more clues. No more leads. Had he been arrested for another crime? Had he died? Or was he still out there, walking among us, waiting for the right moment to strike again? For over 30 years, the I-70 killer has remained just out of reach, one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history. And this is his story. He never needed more than a few minutes. He walked in, pulled the trigger, and disappeared. No hesitation. No struggle. No words exchanged. Just a single gunshot, a body left behind, and a door swinging closed in the wind. 6 lives. 6 small businesses. 6 quiet moments shattered in the same way. The pattern was unmistakable, each crime seen a reflection of the last. A lone employee, working the counter. A single .22 caliber round, fired from close range. The cash register untouched. No signs of a getaway car, no footprints in the dust, no fingerprints on the glass. It was as if he had never been there at all. But he had. And the proof was in the silence he left behind. The first victim was a young woman working the evening shift at a Payless shoe source in Indianapolis. It was April 8, 1992. Customers had come and gone all day, the usual rhythm of sales and small talk. But when closing time neared, something changed. A final customer entered the store, one who wouldn't be making a purchase. She never had a chance to scream. No calls for help. No sound at all, except the muffled pop of a gunshot before the store fell into darkness. Just 2 days later, nearly 400 miles away, another call came in. Another store. Another clerk. Same execution. Same weapon. And then, it happened again. And again. And again. Each time, the story was the same. Each time, investigators arrived to find the same chilling scene, a store undisturbed, except for the body left behind. No money missing. No security cameras capturing his movements. Just the lingering question, why? Police combed through witness statements, desperate for a lead. Only a handful of people had seen him, fleeting glimpses of a man who slipped in and out unnoticed. The descriptions were vague. A tall, thin man. Sandy-colored hair. No facial hair, no scars, no tattoos. He looked ordinary. So ordinary that no one could remember anything more about him. The kind of person who could stand behind you in line at a gas station and never catch your eye. The kind of person you'd never think twice about, until it was too late. Then, just as suddenly as the killings had started, they stopped. May 7, 1992. A quiet gift shop in Raytown, Missouri. The same setup, the same method. The 6th victim. The last confirmed killing. After that, the highway fell silent. No more bodies. No more crime scenes. The I-70 killer vanished, as if he had never existed. Had he been arrested for another crime, his true nature hidden behind bars under a different name? Had he died, taking his secrets with him? Or did he simply walk away, slipping back into a life where no one suspected the truth? For more than 30 years, detectives have searched for him. But all they have are questions. And a name that doesn't belong to a face. And after all this time, one question remains, did he really stop? Or did he just change? The last known victim fell silent on May 7, 1992. After that, nothing. No more bodies. No more calls. The pattern stopped, as if the killer had vanished into thin air. Authorities continued to scour the same familiar highways, but each town brought the same frustrating results. Nothing. No leads. No suspects. Just another unsolved case added to the growing list of disappearances across the nation. But the question remains, was the I-70 killer caught? Had the authorities finally closed in on the shadowy figure who had tormented these small communities for weeks? Or did he simply shift his methods, moving on to a new location, a new identity, a new way of killing? Was he still out there, walking unnoticed in a crowd, biding his time until the moment was right? In the years that followed, detectives began to consider that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't disappeared. Perhaps, like so many others before him, he had simply adapted. A new strategy. A different way of hunting. A fresh trail to follow, one that would be even harder to trace. It's a chilling thought. The killer who can vanish, not because he's hidden, but because he's become invisible. No more small stores. No more lone clerks. A new identity, a new location. The old pattern, discarded. The only thing left behind. The faintest traces of fear in the places he's been, the echoes of his footsteps that can still be heard by those who dare to remember. Could it be that the I-70 killer was never caught because he was already hiding in plain sight? Is he still watching, waiting for that perfect opportunity to strike again, even now, decades later? The case remains unsolved. But the truth? The truth may still be out there, lurking, hidden in the silence. Somewhere along the same highways. Somewhere in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the law. Was his silence a mark of fear, or a sign of something far worse? A killer who doesn't just disappear, but one who simply knows when to wait, and when to strike. For now, all we have is a name, a face that will never be found, and a road that still winds through towns, quiet and empty, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Story 3. It was supposed to be a tragic accident. Another young man, found dead in the water. The cause, drowning. The scene, a body of water. The story, a moment of misfortune. But there was something about these deaths, something that didn't sit right. It was more than just the grief of families left behind. It was the feeling of something, unexplained. Across the United States, young men began turning up dead, their bodies discovered in lakes, rivers, or streams. They were the kind of cases you'd expect from the late-night headlines: a party gone wrong, a late-night swim, too much alcohol. The police chalked it up to simple misadventure, even if the details were fuzzy. After all, young men tend to drink, and bodies tend to end up in water. But then, as the deaths mounted, something changed. As investigators scoured the scenes, something unexpected was discovered. Hidden in plain sight, on walls or near the banks of rivers, in places no one thought to look, a symbol began to appear, a symbol of a face, drawn hastily in graffiti. A smiley face. But this wasn't some harmless doodle. This was something else, something chilling. What started as one symbol soon grew into a pattern. These so-called smiley faces started showing up at the scene of every death. It was as if someone was trying to leave a mark, to make sure the world knew there was more to these deaths than met the eye. But who was behind it? And why? Was it a coincidence, or was something far darker at play? One case was ruled an accident, just like the others. But when investigators looked closer, they realized that there was something strange about the position of the bodies. The placement didn't make sense. The way the victims were found didn't add up with the natural progression of drowning. And then there were the locations themselves, secluded, out-of-the-way places that didn't scream accident. These weren't the kinds of places someone would wander into if they had been drinking. There was a method to the madness, a pattern hidden behind the appearances of a tragic loss. But it wasn't just the symbols that raised suspicion. It was the sheer number of deaths. These young men, all seemingly leading normal lives, began to pile up. And with each new body discovered, the theory grew stronger. Was there a connection? Were these truly isolated incidents, or was there something more? A group, perhaps. A killer or killers who had been operating in plain sight, leaving behind their mark each time they struck. How could it be that no one had noticed? How could it be that no one had put the pieces together sooner? Some believed the deaths were the work of a single individual, others thought it could be a group. But what was certain was this: the smiley face symbol had become more than just a coincidence. It had become a calling card. A sign that something much darker was lurking in the background, and that the true nature of these deaths had been hidden in plain sight all along. The question remained: was it a prank, a sick joke, or a sign of something more? The answers were elusive, and the theories only seemed to grow with every new drowning that took place. And as the bodies continued to surface, so did the mystery. Who was behind it? And what did the smiley face mean? It started with one tragic drowning, a young man found lifeless in a river. It seemed like an unfortunate but understandable accident. But when the second body turned up, then a third, something felt off. It wasn't just the number. It was the way they had been discovered, each one of them, seemingly in the same way. Each drowning with no obvious cause beyond the water itself. But that wasn't all. What had once seemed like isolated incidents now looked like something much darker. Something more calculated. After the fourth and fifth bodies turned up, something unusual began to appear at the scene of each death. Graffiti. At first, it was overlooked, a simple smiley face drawn hastily on a nearby wall or tree. A strange, almost childlike symbol that seemed to mean nothing at all. But then, more bodies turned up. And the smiley faces followed. Scattered across towns and states, in places where the young men had been found dead. The police didn't know what to make of it, dismissing it as a coincidence, one sick prank after another. But could it be that this symbol, so simple yet so persistent, was something more? Could it have been the mark of someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along? It didn't take long for the idea to spread, the theory that these weren't accidents. That there was a deeper connection. A network of killers, operating undetected. A team that had been working together, striking in different places, different times, but always leaving their mark. The smiley face. A signature. Some believed the symbol was a clue. Maybe a reminder, a signal that the killer or killers were close by, watching, waiting. Maybe it was a warning. A sign that their work was far from over. And with each new death, the idea of a conspiracy grew. A group operating with frightening precision and control. But no one had any concrete evidence. Just the bodies. And the smiley faces. At first, the police had laughed it off. They called it a coincidence. That's what they told the families, too, families who were grieving, demanding answers they didn't have. How could this be an accident, they asked, when it was happening over and over again, in such similar circumstances? How could they dismiss the patterns that were emerging? The police, however, dismissed them. The smiley faces, the similarities between the deaths, they were just anomalies. Not enough to connect the dots. But was that enough? Or were they missing something? Could a group be orchestrating these deaths, leaving behind a symbol to mock the very idea of justice? The authorities didn't think so. But as the bodies continued to surface, the questions only multiplied. Each death seemed like it added another piece to the puzzle. But every answer was elusive. The pattern of the drownings was not clear enough to trace, yet it seemed unmistakable. Young men, alone, in the early hours of the morning, often after a night of drinking. But was that the whole story? Or were these victims simply bait in a larger, more calculated game? For the families left behind, there was no closure. Only more questions. Were their sons, brothers, and friends just victims of a cruel twist of fate? Or was something more deliberate at play, hidden in plain sight, masked by the appearance of natural tragedy? As the media began to catch wind of the story, the theory began to grow. Some began to speculate that these drownings weren't isolated events at all, but parts of a larger, far-reaching conspiracy, a conspiracy that could involve multiple killers, each one acting with impunity, using the smiley face as a mark to claim their territory. And with each new body, the fear grew. Not just of the drownings themselves, but of what was still hidden. Was this a joke? Or was there a darker force behind it all, operating from the shadows, leaving cryptic messages on the walls, taunting those who tried to solve the mystery. Who are the men behind the smiley faces? And what do they want? These questions linger. And as long as the symbol remains, the mystery continues to haunt the places where the waters run dark. For years, investigators have insisted that the theory of a group, a network of killers, is nothing more than that, a theory. A story woven together by journalists, armchair detectives, and those desperate for answers. A coincidence, they say, a series of random drownings with no connection but for the unsettling symbols left behind. But if that's all it is, why do the bodies keep turning up? What if this isn't some isolated event? What if there's more to this than we've been led to believe? What if the smiley face killers, if such a thing exists, are still out there, watching, waiting, leaving their mark on the world while no one is looking? Every new death, every new symbol found, only raises more questions. No one can say for sure. Police have dismissed the idea as a coincidence, or worse, just a sick joke played by some twisted individual. But the evidence, the bodies, the recurring signs, they're harder to ignore. The families of the victims still search for answers. They haven't given up. How can they? A son, a brother, a friend, found dead in a remote lake, with nothing but a smiley face to suggest that something far more calculated was at play. And as the cases continue to pile up, the more unsettling the thought becomes, what if the killers are real? What if they've been operating in the shadows, slipping through the cracks unnoticed? How could this be a coincidence? How could it all be just random? Each body, each death, each piece of graffiti, it doesn't fit the narrative of an accident. Something doesn't add up, and it leaves us wondering, if the smiley face killers are just a theory, then why does the pattern seem to grow with every passing year? Maybe there's more to this than we'll ever know. Or perhaps we've been too quick to dismiss the evidence right in front of us, content with the easy explanations. But some mysteries aren't meant to be solved so easily. We may never know the truth. But what if the killers are out there, right now, waiting for the next moment to strike? The story isn't over. And what happens next may be even darker than we could have ever imagined. Coming up, another case, one that continues to haunt a city. A case that might just change everything we thought we knew about how killers operate in plain sight. Story 4. To the world around him, Herb Baumeister was the epitome of success. A prosperous businessman who ran a successful chain of thrift stores, respected by his peers, and admired by his neighbors. He had a picture-perfect family, 2 children, a beautiful wife, the kind of suburban life that seemed to promise peace and stability. He was the last person anyone would have suspected. But behind closed doors, Herb Baumeister was hiding a dark secret. One so twisted, so horrifying, that even those who thought they knew him the best would be left in stunned disbelief. As the days passed, and the people who knew him were asked about his life, they would all speak of a man who seemed perfectly normal, even charming. They would talk about his quiet demeanor, his kindness, his family dinners, his generosity. But no one, not a single soul, would have guessed the truth. Then one day, a discovery was made, one that would shatter the illusion of the perfect life and expose the darkness that lay beneath. It began with a missing persons case, a few reports that had gone unnoticed at first. But as the investigation into Baumeister deepened, a chilling pattern emerged. And then, the police were called in to search his estate. Herb's house, a sprawling property tucked away in the suburbs, seemed like a place of safety. The kind of place where children played and neighbors waved from their porches. But when detectives combed through the house, what they found was nothing short of horrifying. There, hidden in plain sight, were the secrets of a man who had spent years living a double life. The horrifying truth would soon be revealed. Herb Baumeister was not just a businessman. He was a predator. The search uncovered something that no one could have imagined. Evidence of multiple lives lost. The remains of young men, victims who had seemingly vanished without a trace, were discovered on his property, buried in a manner that suggested years of concealment. What began as a search for missing persons quickly turned into the unraveling of a dark, terrifying truth. But how had this man managed to hide in plain sight for so long? How had he, so trusted by those around him, been able to mask his true nature, to blend into the community without raising suspicion? And more chillingly, what drove a man who seemed to have everything to live a secret life as a killer? It was a question that no one could answer. Not yet. Herb Baumeister had been living in a world of secrets. A world that had remained hidden behind the veil of suburban normalcy. But the discovery of those bodies, the buried remains of the victims, would change everything. No one could pretend anymore. No one could turn a blind eye. The quiet, respectful businessman had a dark, disturbing side that no one had ever suspected. And now, the truth was out. As the investigation continued, authorities began to piece together the horrors that had been hidden for so long. But there was still much left unanswered. How many had there been? How long had Baumeister been living his secret life? And what would the final toll be when the truth finally came to light? This is the story of Herb Baumeister, one man, two lives, and a secret that would forever change everything. For years, young men had been disappearing without a trace. They were last seen in bars, on the streets, heading home from nights out with friends, normal, unremarkable moments that should have led them safely back to their lives. But they never did. One by one, they vanished, leaving behind nothing but unanswered phone calls, worried families, and the quiet terror of not knowing what had happened. For the longest time, no one connected the cases. People go missing every day, and without evidence of foul play, there was little that could be done. Some assumed the men had simply walked away from their old lives. Others believed they had fallen victim to the dangers of the night, lost to accidents or the unknown. The truth, however, was far worse than anyone imagined. The name Herb Baumeister wasn't one that initially raised alarm. A business owner. A family man. The kind of person no one would suspect. But there were whispers, stories that never quite reached the light of day. Men had gone missing, and some had last been seen near his business. It was enough to spark concern in those who were paying attention, but it wasn't enough to warrant a search, to force the doors open, to see what was hidden inside. But then, the suspicions grew louder. An investigation began. And finally, the police gained access to the one place that no one had ever thought to look, his estate, Fox Hollow Farm. They began to dig. At first, they weren't sure what they would find. Maybe nothing. Maybe something explainable. But then, they saw it. A glimpse of something out of place, something that did not belong. The more they dug, the clearer the truth became. The ground was not just dirt and stone, it was something else entirely. Bone. Fragments at first, but then more. Pieces of a horror that had remained hidden for years, waiting to be found. The search continued, and with every hour, the scope of the nightmare grew. Skeletal remains, scattered beneath the surface, buried in shallow graves. There was no longer any doubt, Herb Baumeister's home had become a graveyard. And the victims, once only names on missing persons reports, were finally being uncovered. Word spread quickly. The media descended. Neighbors who had once waved at Baumeister from across the street now stood in disbelief, watching as investigators carried away the evidence of what had been hidden in their midst for so long. Families who had spent years searching for answers were now faced with a truth far more horrifying than they had ever imagined. But before Baumeister could be confronted, before he could be questioned, he disappeared. He fled the state, leaving behind his home, his business, and the remains of the lives he had taken. And then, in a remote park in Canada, his body was found. A single gunshot. A suicide note left behind. But no apology. No explanation. Just the abrupt, final act of a man who had spent years concealing the truth. And with his death, the most important questions went unanswered. How many victims were there? Who had been left behind, their names never spoken, their remains never found? And had he truly acted alone? Even now, the full extent of Baumeister's crimes remains unknown. There are those who believe more victims are still out there, their stories untold. The truth, whatever it may be, was buried long before the first body was ever found. And it may never be fully unearthed. With his death, the case was considered closed. No trial. No final confession. Just a single gunshot in a foreign land, ending the life of a man who had kept his darkest secrets locked away. For some, his suicide was an admission of guilt, a silent acknowledgement of the horrors he had carried out. But for others, it left behind more questions than answers. The police had uncovered bones, more than they could have imagined, scattered across the property, hidden beneath layers of soil that had held them for years. They identified some. Others were too far gone, reduced to fragments, their names lost to time. But one question remained: were they all his victims? There were whispers of something more. A theory that refused to fade. Herb Baumeister had traveled frequently. He knew the stretch of highway that cut through the Midwest, the very road where another killer had once prowled. And then there were the disappearances, men who had gone missing far from his home, their bodies never found. Was it possible that Baumeister had been responsible for more than just what lay beneath Fox Hollow Farm? Or was he part of something larger? Could another killer have been out there, hunting in the same shadows? The authorities never proved a connection, but the questions never went away. Two killers operating in the same region, during the same period, preying on similar victims, it was too much to ignore. The thought was unsettling. What if there was another? What if Baumeister was only one piece of a much larger puzzle? Some believe he worked alone. That Fox Hollow Farm was his domain, his hunting ground, and his secrets died with him. But others aren't so sure. Because there was another case, another series of murders, carried out with precision and vanishing without a trace. The I-70 killer. A name without a face. A ghost that left no evidence, no pattern, except for the bodies left behind. Was it a coincidence? Two killers haunting the same highway, their crimes overlapping in time and place. Or is there a missing link, one that will never be found? The I-70 killer's victims were different, his method distinct. But the randomness of it all, the lack of an identity, the way he seemed to disappear into thin air, it left a void where answers should have been. Baumeister is gone. His story ended with a single bullet, his motives buried along with him. But the I-70 killer, he was never caught. Never named. Never seen again. A mystery frozen in time, waiting in the archives of unsolved cases. And if he was never caught, then the real question remains: did he simply stop? Or is he still out there, watching, waiting, ready to strike again? Story 5. It began like any other morning. A mother wakes before the sun has fully risen, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. Her head aches, a dull, throbbing pain behind her temples. She moves through the familiar routine, padding softly across the kitchen floor. She reaches for the medicine cabinet, the one she's opened 100 times before. Inside, a small bottle of Tylenol. Harmless. Ordinary. She shakes 2 capsules into her palm, swallows them with a sip of water, and exhales. Within hours, she will be gone. Across town, a father prepares for another long day at work. His children still sleep, their dreams untouched by the worries of adulthood. His wife hums softly as she brews coffee, the scent filling the air. He, too, has a headache. Just a small one, the kind he wouldn't normally notice. But the bottle is right there on the counter. He pops open the cap, swallows a pill, kisses his wife goodbye, and steps out the door. By nightfall, his family will be planning his funeral. A 12-year-old girl, home from school with a slight fever, lays curled on the couch. Her mother strokes her hair, whispers reassurances. Just a little medicine, she says, pressing a capsule into her daughter's hand. A child's trust is absolute. She swallows. And within minutes, her body begins to shut down. Panic had not yet taken hold. No alarms had been raised. These deaths, isolated, scattered, were tragedies, but nothing more. No one saw the pattern. Not yet. But that would change. Over the next 48 hours, the bodies would begin to pile up. A postal worker, collapsing on his kitchen floor. A young woman, found unresponsive in her apartment. A man in his prime, taken down by something invisible, something insidious. The victims had never met. They had no connection to one another, except for one thing. Each of them had taken the same medication. Each of them had reached for relief, only to be met with death. Then came the realization. This wasn't an illness. This wasn't a bad batch. This was something far more terrifying. Someone had tampered with the medicine. Someone had taken an ordinary bottle of Tylenol, found in homes across the country, trusted by millions, and turned it into a weapon. And the worst part? No one knew how many bottles had been poisoned. No one knew where the killer would strike next. Anyone could be next. The city of Chicago was about to be gripped by fear. The nation was about to witness something it had never seen before. A product meant to heal had been turned into a silent killer. And whoever was behind it was still out there. It happened fast. Too fast. 7 lives lost in just a matter of days. A mother. A father. A child. A coworker. A stranger. No pattern. No connection. They had never crossed paths, never spoken a single word to each other. And yet, they were all victims of the same unseen hand. At first, the deaths seemed random. A medical anomaly. An unexplained tragedy. But then the truth came into focus. The same medication. The same symptoms. The same, irreversible fate. And that's when the fear set in. The phone calls started. Hospitals reporting unexplained poisonings. Investigators piecing together the timeline. Families struggling to understand how a bottle of over-the-counter pain relief had become an executioner. The news spread like wildfire, and with it, panic. Within days, store shelves were emptied. People tore through their medicine cabinets, dumping bottles into the trash. A nation that once trusted its pharmacies was now gripped by an invisible threat. Then came the recall. The largest in history. More than 31 million bottles pulled from shelves, a billion-dollar decision made in the name of safety. For the first time, an everyday household item, something found in nearly every American home, was no longer a symbol of relief, but of terror. The instructions were clear: if you have Tylenol, do not take it. If you have already taken it, pray that it was safe. People began to question everything. Was it an accident? A disgruntled employee? A targeted attack? And then, the theory that no one wanted to say out loud, was it someone inside the company itself? The investigation turned inward. Johnson & Johnson, the manufacturer of Tylenol, was thrust under scrutiny. Were the pills tampered with before they hit the shelves? Or was the contamination happening after they were already in stores, slipping undetected into the hands of unsuspecting victims? For months, investigators worked tirelessly. Thousands of tips. Hundreds of leads. A handful of suspects. But no arrests. The person responsible had covered their tracks too well. No fingerprints. No security footage. No mistakes. Just empty bottles and lives lost. And then, something even more unsettling. The deaths in Chicago were only the beginning. In the years that followed, copycats emerged. Poisonings across the country. Some intentional, some unexplained. The Tylenol murders had sparked something far worse than fear. They had planted an idea. The perfect crime, executed in plain sight. And no one had been caught. 7 victims. A nationwide panic. An unknown killer who disappeared without a trace. Decades later, the case remains unsolved. And the question lingers: did they ever stop? Or were they simply never found? Whoever did this was never found. No name. No face. No justice. Decades have passed, but the answer remains the same: we don't know who poisoned those bottles. We don't know why. We only know that they vanished, as if they were never there to begin with. Think about that. Someone out there, walking among us, living an ordinary life, once held a vial of cyanide in their hands. Measured it out. Opened the capsules. Poured the poison in. Sealed them back up. Then placed them on a shelf, knowing full well that an innocent person would pick them up, take them home, and swallow their last breath. And they got away with it. How many times have you taken a pill without thinking twice? How often do you trust that what's in the bottle is exactly what it says? That it won't hurt you. That it won't kill you. The Tylenol murders changed everything. Tamper-proof seals. Child-resistant packaging. Safety warnings that didn't exist before. All because one person, one faceless, nameless individual, decided to turn an everyday medicine into a weapon. But here's the question no one likes to ask: was it really just one person? Or was it the beginning of something much bigger? Since 1982, there have been other cases. Other pills. Other bottles. Other deaths. Copycats who saw what happened in Chicago and decided to try it for themselves. How many of those were just accidents? And how many were something else? 5 cases. 5 nightmares that refuse to fade. Stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Which one kept you up the most tonight? Which one made you look over your shoulder, double-check the locks, hesitate before taking a pill? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear what you think. And if you're ready for more, if you want to hear about cases even more disturbing than these, check out the next video. But be warned, some things, once heard, cannot be forgotten. Subscribe now, because the darkest stories are the ones still waiting to be told.